The tension in the air was palpable as Tiffany Trump sat across from a respected journalist on live television. It was meant to be a friendly conversation, a chance for the public to hear her story, her journey, her passions, the things she held close. But the moment the interview began, the atmosphere shifted, as if a storm was gathering. Tiffany smiled, answering questions about her academic achievements and her growing philanthropic efforts, her voice steady, but beneath her calm exterior, there was a hint of nervousness. She was used to scrutiny, but this felt different. Then, without warning, the journalist's tone turned sharp, almost predatory. "Tiffany, you've made headlines time and time again, but tell me, how much of your success is truly earned? Or is it all thanks to your last name?" The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. Tiffany froze. Her heart skipped a beat. She had expected tough questions, but nothing like this, nothing so personal, so pointed. She could feel the cameras on her, the world watching, waiting for her response. The air in the studio seemed to thicken. Tiffany took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the armrest of her chair. She refused to let the journalist see how deeply the words had cut her. She knew how this game worked, how some would try to diminish her accomplishments because of who she was. She straightened up, her voice calm but firm. "My work speaks for itself," she said, her eyes never wavering from the journalist. "The name doesn't define my worth. My actions do." But the journalist wasn't done. "Yet, would anyone even care if your last name wasn't Trump?" That was the moment it hit her, a gut punch, a reminder of the world's harsh, unrelenting judgment. Tiffany's face betrayed nothing, but inside, she felt a storm begin to churn. Somewhere far away, Barron Trump sat in his room, watching. His heart sank as he witnessed the humiliation his sister was enduring. A fire lit inside him, an emotion that was as fierce as it was protective. He knew one thing: this wouldn't stand. The moment the interview ended, Barron Trump was already on his phone. His mind raced as he processed the cruel words that had been directed at his sister. The journalist's voice still echoed in his ears, each syllable like a slap in the face. Barron had never been one for public spectacles, but this felt different. This wasn't just an attack on Tiffany, it was an attack on their entire family. His fingers hovered over the screen of his phone, dialing her number without a second thought. When Tiffany's voice cracked through the line, his heart twisted. "Hey, Barron," she said, her tone light but tinged with something he couldn't ignore. "Tiff, are you okay?" His voice was steady, but inside, his emotions were spiraling. He could tell she was holding it together for the moment, but he wasn't fooled. He knew his sister well enough to sense the quiet storm brewing behind her words. "I'm fine," she replied quickly, but Barron could hear the weight in her voice. "It's just exhausting. I've worked so hard and it's never enough, you know?" Her words were soft, but the pain was unmistakable. Barron's jaw clenched. He could feel her hurt, the sting of being belittled despite everything she had accomplished. But that wasn't what fueled him. What hit him the hardest was the injustice. His sister didn't deserve this. No one deserved to be torn apart for no reason other than to satisfy someone else's agenda. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone," Barron said, his voice firm now, filled with conviction. "I'll take care of this. I'm not going to let them get away with it." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Barron could hear Tiffany take a slow breath, as if weighing his words. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you going to do?" Barron smiled, a flicker of determination in his eyes. Something they won't expect. As he ended the call, his mind began to form a plan that would not only protect his sister, but also send a clear message. This battle was just beginning, and he wasn't going to let anyone, least of all the journalist, get away with undermining his family. The phone call had ended, but Barron's mind was still racing. Tiffany's words echoed in his ears, her frustration and pain pulling him deeper into the moment. This wasn't just a typical media attack. It was personal. It wasn't enough to feel angry or upset. Barron needed something more. He needed to prove, once and for all, that the journalist's attack wasn't just a slip of the tongue. It was a calculated, malicious attempt to tear down his sister. Barron sat at his desk, the soft hum of his laptop the only sound in the room. He opened the browser, searching for past interviews with the journalist who had insulted Tiffany. Every interview, every clip, was a breadcrumb, a clue waiting to be uncovered. His fingers typed quickly, scanning for patterns, inconsistencies. He wasn't just searching for answers, he was searching for ammunition, the kind that would hit hard and fast, leaving no room for denial. With each new article he found, the anger inside him simmered, bubbling to the surface. The journalist's history of provocative and biased questions was undeniable. They had done this before, attacked people, not for their actions, but for who they were. It wasn't about fair criticism. It was about creating controversy for the sake of headlines. Barron felt his blood boil as he read through article after article, his heart pounding with every sentence that undermined someone's dignity. He clicked on a particularly revealing video, and as he watched the journalist tear apart another public figure, Barron's face hardened. He wasn't just going to let this go. This wasn't about defending Tiffany anymore. This was about exposing a pattern of cruelty that had gone unchecked for too long. Barron leaned back in his chair, the weight of the plan settling in. He knew the next step. The world would see the truth, whether they wanted to or not. The fight was about to get real, and Barron was ready to take it to the next level. As Barron reviewed the journalist's past interviews, anger coursed through him. But there was something else, something unexpected. The more he watched, the more a feeling of justice began to build inside him. He wasn't alone in this fight. The world was already speaking. Social media was alive with voices. People who saw the attack on Tiffany for what it truly was. It wasn't just one journalist's bias. It was a reflection of a wider culture that tore down the vulnerable for sport. The hashtag #StandWithTiffany exploded across Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Tweets of support flooded in, with people sharing stories of their own experiences with unfair judgment. Tiffany's name was trending, not for the reasons the journalist had hoped, but for something much more powerful. People were rallying around her, not as a celebrity or a figure tied to a political family, but as a person who deserved respect and dignity. The weight of that support wrapped around Barron like a comforting shield. Sitting at his desk, Barron scrolled through the flood of messages. The comments were flooded with heartwarming words from ordinary people, strangers, who admired Tiffany's strength and determination. "She doesn't deserve this," one person wrote. "She's an inspiration." Another commented, "You can't tear someone down for being successful. That's just envy." The outpouring of kindness was overwhelming. It felt like a powerful, collective voice, a reminder that there was more good in the world than the media would often lead people to believe. Barron's heart swelled as he read the messages, but beneath that pride, there was still a fire. He wasn't just fighting for Tiffany anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had been unfairly criticized, who had been looked down on simply because of who they were. This wasn't just about family anymore. This was a movement, and Barron knew it was only the beginning. His resolve grew stronger as he closed his laptop. The public had spoken, and now it was time to make sure the world heard them, loud and clear. The next morning, Barron stood before the mirror, his reflection staring back at him with a mixture of resolve and fury. The weight of everything that had happened pressed heavily on his chest. The world had seen Tiffany's vulnerability, but what they didn't see was the quiet, unrelenting determination that burned inside her, and inside him. He wasn't just her brother, he was her protector. And in that moment, Barron realized he was ready to do whatever it took to make sure no one ever made her feel that way again. As the news cycle continued, the journalist's interview with Tiffany continued to make waves. News outlets had picked up on the tension, reporting the controversy with sensationalized headlines that painted Tiffany as the victim and the journalist as the villain. But Barron was focused on something far more important: the opportunity to act. The public outcry had been deafening, but it wasn't enough. He needed to make sure Tiffany's voice was heard louder than ever. It wasn't long before Barron received the call. The journalist had agreed to a follow-up interview, one that would address the fallout from their previous encounter. The moment was set to air live, and Barron knew this was the opportunity he'd been waiting for. This was no longer about defending his sister. It was about confronting the very culture that allowed people to tear others down for nothing more than entertainment. Barron's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the phone, dialing Tiffany's number. She picked up after a few rings. Her voice sounded softer this time, but there was an undercurrent of something fierce beneath it. "I'm ready," she said simply. Barron smiled. He could hear the strength in her voice, and it only fueled his resolve. "This time, we do it our way." As the countdown to the interview began, Barron knew that this wasn't just about clearing Tiffany's name. It was about challenging an industry that thrived on cruelty. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and Barron was determined to see it through. The day had arrived, the air thick with anticipation. Tiffany stood backstage, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she adjusted her outfit, making sure everything was perfect. But it wasn't the clothes or her appearance that weighed heavily on her mind. It was the looming confrontation. The same journalist who had attempted to tear her down was now waiting for her, and she knew this would be the moment that defined everything. She wasn't just walking into another interview, she was walking into the lion's den. But this time, she wasn't alone. Barron was with her, in spirit and in heart, as he had been every step of the way. Tiffany took a deep breath, the air cool in her lungs. The echo of Barron's words the night before ran through her mind, steadying her. "We do it our way." It wasn't just a statement, it was a promise. A promise that no matter what the journalist threw at her, she would stand her ground. As she walked toward the stage, the lights flashed in her eyes, blinding her for a moment. But then, as she stepped into the spotlight, she felt something else take hold of her. Confidence. She wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to let the narrative be written for her. This was her story, and she was ready to tell it. The journalist sat across from her, their smug smile barely concealed behind their professional demeanor. "Tiffany," they began, "it's good to have you back. I'm sure you've been reflecting on our last conversation." Tiffany locked eyes with them, her voice steady, but her words cutting through the air like a blade. "I've been reflecting, yes. And I've decided it's time for you to hear the truth, my truth." The journalist's expression shifted, but Tiffany didn't give them the chance to regroup. She was no longer the subject of their attack. She was the one taking control of the narrative. Barron had been right. This was their moment, and Tiffany wasn't going to let anyone take it away. The tables had turned. The moment Tiffany spoke, a hush fell over the studio. Her voice wasn't loud or forceful, but it carried a quiet power, one that couldn't be ignored. The journalists sat there, poised, but for the first time there was uncertainty in their eyes. Tiffany wasn't the trembling figure they had hoped to see. No, she was standing firm, rooted in her truth, and nothing could shake that. "I've spent years working hard, doing everything I can to make a real difference," Tiffany began, her gaze unwavering. "I've built my own path, one that's separate from the world I was born into. And to reduce my efforts to my last name is not only insulting, it's lazy." Her words hung in the air, settling like dust. The studio audience, once indifferent, seemed to lean in, captivated by her quiet strength. There was a raw honesty in her voice, something that reached deeper than any scripted response the journalist had anticipated. The journalist, caught off guard, cleared their throat and attempted to regain control of the conversation. "But isn't it true that your public image has been largely shaped by your family's name and influence?" they asked, trying to steer the narrative back to familiar ground. Tiffany didn't flinch. She leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing. "My family's name has opened doors, yes, but it's my work, my choices, and my actions that keep those doors open. I've never asked for special treatment. I've fought for every opportunity I've had, and that is something you cannot take away." Her words were a punch to the gut, a challenge thrown directly back at the journalist. The studio was silent, the air thick with tension. Tiffany's voice, once soft, now rang with conviction. "You want to talk about privilege? Fine. Let's talk about the privilege of having a platform to judge others. But understand this. No amount of criticism can erase the work I've done or the person I am. Barron, watching from backstage, felt a surge of pride. This was more than just a rebuttal. It was a declaration. Tiffany wasn't just defending herself. She was dismantling the entire narrative that had been built around her. The truth, in all its raw power, had finally been set free. The journalist sat back, visibly taken aback by Tiffany's unwavering response. The air between them thickened, as if the room itself held its breath, waiting for what would come next. Tiffany's words, sharp and unyielding, had shattered the fragile illusion the journalist had built. There was no room left for manipulation or deflection. This wasn't just about defending herself anymore. It was about reclaiming her story, her identity. And in that moment, Tiffany knew she had taken back control. The studio, once filled with an undercurrent of tension, now buzzed with a palpable shift. The journalist had been trained to handle tough interviews, but they were no match for Tiffany's quiet strength. She wasn't just speaking to the camera anymore. She was speaking to every person who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or attacked for reasons beyond their control. You can't undermine someone's worth based on who they are related to, Tiffany continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. Everyone deserves to be seen for their own actions, their own character, and if you can't understand that, then maybe it's not the world that's broken. It's the system that allows these attacks to continue. Her words weren't just for the journalist, they were for the millions who had quietly endured similar injustices. In that room, in front of the cameras, Tiffany became the voice for those who couldn't fight back. Barron watched, a quiet fire burning within him. This wasn't just about standing up for Tiffany anymore. This was about standing up for what was right. And in that moment, something shifted in Barron. The journalist's attempt to bring down his sister had only made her stronger. Tiffany wasn't just surviving the attack. She was turning it into a triumph. The turning point had arrived, and there was no going back. This wasn't just an interview. It was a message to the world. As Tiffany's words lingered in the air, there was a brief, almost surreal moment of silence. The journalist had no retort. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, they were speechless. The audacity of their attack, their relentless pursuit to bring down someone who had done nothing wrong, was met with an undeniable force, a force that could no longer be ignored. The room, once filled with tension, now felt heavy with the weight of truth. Tiffany remained calm, but there was a fierceness behind her eyes, an unspoken challenge. She wasn't asking for their approval or validation anymore. She had already won. It wasn't about the outcome of this interview, it was about the journey she had taken to get here. The strength she had found within herself was irreplaceable, something no one could ever take from her. Across from her, the journalist shuffled papers, clearly struggling to regain composure. But the damage was done. Tiffany had made her stand, and the world would hear it. The public was no longer just a passive observer in this story. They were part of it, supporting her, fighting alongside her. Every message of support, every tweet, every shared post had built a movement. The once distant criticism now seemed insignificant. Barron, watching from the wings of the studio, could feel the shift. He could see it in Tiffany's face, the quiet satisfaction that came with knowing she had spoken her truth. She wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for anyone who had been forced into silence by cruel words, unfair standards, or biased narratives. As the interview came to a close, Tiffany offered a final thought, her voice steady but powerful. The world will always try to define you, but you get to decide who you are, and no one can take that from you. It was the final blow, and the journalist had nothing left to say. The silence in the room spoke volumes. This battle had been won, not by words, but by truth. The final words hung in the air like a victory cry, a declaration that could not be erased. Tiffany had spoken with a calm intensity, but in that silence, everything had changed. The journalists sat frozen, their attempt to regain control of the conversation futile. Tiffany's quiet triumph was a testament to the power of truth, of standing firm in the face of unjust scrutiny. Barron, watching her from behind the scenes, couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. His sister hadn't just defended herself. She had reshaped the narrative, turning a hostile interview into a moment of empowerment. As the cameras cut off and the studio lights dimmed, Tiffany walked off the stage with a quiet confidence. The relief that washed over her was palpable, but there was also something deeper, a sense of purpose that had solidified in the wake of this battle. She hadn't just won for herself. She had won for anyone who had ever been unfairly targeted, for anyone who had ever felt their voice silenced by prejudice or bias. The aftermath of the interview was immediate. Social media exploded with praise for Tiffany, with people from all walks of life sharing their support. The hashtag #StandWithTiffany continued to trend, but now it had evolved into something more, something powerful. People weren't just supporting her, they were standing up for each other. The world was awakening to a new truth. Kindness, strength, and resilience were far stronger than the media's destructive narratives. Barron knew this was only the beginning. What started as a family's defense of their own had turned into a movement, one that called for integrity and respect in an industry that often thrived on negativity. Now, it was up to all of us to carry that message forward, to speak up when we see injustice, to support each other, to fight for fairness. The battle is far from over, but together, we can make sure the truth always prevails. If you believe in standing up for what's right, share this story. Let's make sure the world hears us, loud and clear.